We move on now to our final possible talk from Nick Darwell-Smith, Vice President of Partnerships and Digital Strategy at ParExcel. You may know Nick. For more than 28 years, he has concentrated on clinical R&D operations, IT, and consulting, and his specialty, digital innovation, whether wearables, real-world evidence, or machine learning and AI. His focus today, what will clinical trials look like in the future? Here's Nick.
Thanks, Mike. Clearly, there are a number of different topics that we could talk about related to how technology can improve the conduct of clinical trials in terms of their success and the efficiency. I've chosen these four because I believe that they will have a profound influence on how we conduct clinical trials and digital trials of the future. So I'm going to kick us off with talking about acquisition of technology. So we're all familiar with the build versus buy discussion with technology acquisition. I've highlighted just a few of the pros and cons here because I think they're particularly pertinent as we move into the post-pandemic or even during the pandemic, the challenges that we've had to react very quickly to the changing landscape and the fact that this landscape is not going anywhere. We are seeing continuing change and the challenge that results from that. So on the buy front, there's a significant pro with being able to rapidly find partners to tackle these new challenges. And the fact that you can actually try out more than once simultaneously to see what works and what doesn't work. And that is particularly true now that we've got the capability to use the cloud and the cloud services. So you can try out multiple simultaneous partners that you find very quickly for very little capital investment. To pick out one very important consideration on the own front, the build option, that pressure to maximize use on suboptimal opportunities. So what we've seen is when an organization invests millions of dollars in a particular solution, they start to try and utilize that solution on every available clinical trial opportunity that comes through. And of course, that means you're trying to get them all to look like nails when you're holding that hammer. And what we want to do is make sure that the technology that we select is as fit for purpose as possible. And we'll be talking about an example of that with DCT and the drive to have just a single app on the smartphone of a patient. So just to give one example of the need to rapidly select technologies and potentially try out more than one at the same time. During the early parts of COVID, obviously the pandemic created two particular challenges for us. The ability for patients to take part in clinical trials from home. So that, of course, is decentralized trial, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the other one is to try and allow CRAs to be active on trials without the need for them to go to a site. So this is what you see on the third row of this table, remote SDV and SDR. So typically, source data verification, that check of the patient record in the EMR to the contents of the EDC database, that's done on site by a CRA that has access to the EMR. And source data review, that holistic review of the patient record, similarly, you would do that, with direct access. So in a remote setting, of course, the ideal situation there is that you have that remote access to an EMR system. The unfortunate thing is only around 10% of sites globally can give you that remote access. And it's a little bit better in the US, it's about 30%, but still it's clear that we need other solutions to this particular problem. So we searched across the partners that we are aware of and even looked at some that we hadn't come across before. and we identified the EISF, so that's Investigator Site File. Now, there's a number of different solutions in this market, and we're actually using more than one. But there was a particular one that was free to the sites, that is owned by the site. So you can see it as an extension of the EMR. So it removed any issues with the need to de-identify patient records when you transfer them onto this environment. The site controls access. So it's very much an extension of the site system. And that allows the site to give access to one CRA who would be then able to log in and do the remote SDV and SDR. And from the identification to actually having a site be able to use this was just a matter of weeks. If we had needed to build such a solution, you can imagine that would not have been possible in such a short period of time. And that's just one illustration of the benefits that we see with that build versus buy scenario. So now I'm going to talk about Esource, and Esource is very pertinent in the SDV topic, of course, because if your data is Esource, there is no SDV. There's no source data to check the EDC data against. Of course, SDR doesn't go away. You still need to do that source data review because you're looking that holistic review of the patient record. You're looking for, adverse events and other data that you may have missed. But SDV can go away. So a lot of people are pretty interested in Esource, not just during the pandemic, but afterwards. There's a major sort of shift in the industry, seeing as can we maximize the use of Esource? So Esource, there's lots of different flavors. Clearly ePro, so patient-reported data is Esource by its nature. And of course, if you can get that direct feed from EMR, and we will talk about that with the real-world data topic, then of course, EMR data is also Esource. This slide is about ClinRO, so that's clinician-reported outcomes. So typically that's when a clinician is sitting with a patient at the bedside or in person, and they're using, a mobile device typically and a stylus maybe to collect data as they're discussing with the patient or examining the patient. And of course, because that's not going into a separate EMR system, that's considered Esource. Just as a warning on clinician-reported outcome, and it does have a place in our industry, absolutely, and we're going to see more use of it, and there's some very good examples out there. If the patients are sick, if they're hospitalized, particularly if they're unconscious, life-threatening type illness, typically what we've seen is clinicians do not want to use your technology in that scenario. They want to revert to standard practice, which is, of course, use of an EMR system and a separate transcription into the technology we provide. So that's the classical EDC workflow with queries and, of course, SDV. So that's understandable because, in that situation, they want to focus on the patient care. Which is, of course, always a concern for us as well. So ClinRO has its place, but just be aware of the sick patient characteristics of the use of ClinRO. So to change gears a little bit onto the next topic. So this is DCT. This is Decentralized Trials. So we see this, of course, as a major movement in our industry. That was already going pretty quickly because of patient centricity and metrics like just in the US, 70% of potential patients live more than 2 hours from their nearest site. So this was driving being able to have clinical trials where patients can participate from home. Now, of course, with the pandemic, that's put a lot of pressure on this particular way of running clinical trials, a huge amount of interest. A lot of our proposals now have some form of direct-to-patient, decentralized patient visit characteristics of them. So just to focus on the technology enablers of clinical of decentralized trials. So of course, top left in that middle section, telemedicine. So that's the ability for investigators and patients or site staff in general to have that video call. And you want a scheduler built into that. For that reason, it can make a lot of sense if that's built into the ePro app. So you have that single app to the patient, make it nice and easy for them. They just have the single icon to click on, and they can schedule their visits. They can collect their PRO data, potentially e-consent within the same app. So a lot of the vendors now operating in this space offer eCOA, telemedicine, and e-consent all in one app, which can be very useful. And of course, you can then have patient reminders represented by the patient app bottom left. And of course, you can integrate sensors if there is a need. Now, I think it's worth noting that it's not always a need. There are situations where absolutely you want to be able to give the patient access to data that the sensors are collecting, but in some cases that is not necessary, and you can just send the sensor data across to our analysis data sets. So that is something to bear in mind with the technology enablers of DCT. So moving over to the third topic, this is really around artificial intelligence, and it would not be a complete picture of technology enablers of the future clinical trials if we didn't cover artificial intelligence. There's a huge amount of work going on in this space in our industry, and it is really taking off. We are looking in ParExcel at three core areas of investment. So the left-hand one is the classical automation. Lots of examples of this where you've got, they could be RPA bots, they could be NLP. We've done one where it's going out and it's reading abstracts of articles, identifying which articles you want to bring in, then reading those articles and extracting safety events. So, the kinds of activities that can be extremely expensive to do, and it increases your efficiency and the volume of work that you can accomplish with the same resource. The second area, the operational data analytics and predictions, a lot of work going on here, which is pretty exciting. We are focused in this space on risk-based study execution, so feeding big data sets to machine learning algorithms, looking for those patterns that can indicate risk for the future. And those, of course, those risks are identified much more proactively than we've generally been able to do with our sort of reactive, classical risk-based monitoring type solutions. And then over on the far right, scientific data analytics, all kinds of potential use cases here, patient cohort development, outcomes prediction. And in fact, on this next slide, here is an example of being able to use artificial intelligence and natural language processing to identify subtypes, patient subtypes of a population that all fall under a single ICD code, but ICD-9 code, but the particulars of the subtypes are embedded in the patient notes. So what the NLP is doing is extracting that information, the data from the information in the patient notes, so that we can make that distinction between those patient types, those subtypes. Now, that kind of work with the kind of volumes that you're talking about would not have been possible before artificial intelligence became part of the story. So yeah, lots and lots of use cases. We're going to see an explosion. And the final topic around technology enablers for future digital trials has to be around the inclusion of real-world data. So what you're seeing on this depiction, you've got the sources on the left-hand side. So you've got sites and claims data and other secondary data, registries and others. In the middle, the CDR, that's the clinical data repository, or the canonical data repository, which is a standard way of storing the data. And you've got FHIR, for example, as one way of getting EMR data across to the CDR. And then on the right-hand side, you see some use cases. So type 1, these are live individuals who are able to remotely view EMR records, for example, for SDV or SDR, direct queries into the CDR for feasibility or site selection. Type 2, our classical scientific warehouse, we just spoke about an example of that. Could use that for cohort creation, synthetic cohort creation. And type 3, in some cases, you might want to take secondary data into your EDC database if you want to do edit checks that would be comparing in some way secondary data to the data that we capture in clinical trials. So that gives you some idea of the areas that we're focused on for the future of digital trials. So back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Nick, for that look ahead at what is possible and even probable